His code name's Jackal. He's an exceptional assassin.
Streaming now on Peacock.
He will kill again, unless we stop him.
Academy Award winner Eddie Redmayne.
You're paying me to kill him. I am charging you for getting away.
The Jackal's here. Look at the exits.
BAFTA Award winner Lashana Lynch.
I will find him, and I will kill him myself.
I like to win.
So do I.
The Day of the Jackal. Streaming now, only on Peacock.
With Lululemon, the real gift happens when they're living in it. When you give the fan favorite everywhere belt bag, the real gift is... And when the ultra-soothing Rest Feel slides are the gift, you're really giving them... This holiday, Lululemon makes it easy to give little luxuries that go beyond. Open the moment. Shop now at Lululemon.com.
Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future. Today, we've got another one-off episode for you. I'm talking to the author, Michael Lewis, about Sam Bankman-Fried, the subject of his most recent book, which has just come out in paperback with a new afterword written since Sam Bankman-Fried's trial and conviction. But we're also going to be talking about an idea, a philosophy, effective altruism, the philosophy that Sam Bankman-Fried embraced, for a while seemed to embody, and now may have trashed. An idea with a very interesting history. We recorded this conversation with Michael Lewis late last week when he was in London. As you'll hear, he got to know Sam Bankman-Fried very, very well, amazingly well, when he was writing his book, and he is still in touch with him. He saw Sam Bankman-Fried before, during, and after his fall. For people who don't know what happened to Sam Bankman-Fried, I'm not going to do a lot of context, but the basic outlines of the story. In the summer of 2022, Sam Bankman-Fried was, by all accounts, the richest person in the world under the age of 30. On some estimates, he was worth up to $30 billion. He ran a cryptocurrency exchange called FTX and an investment business called Alameda Research. And then it turned out that when the investment business, got into trouble, he used depositors' accounts from the cryptocurrency exchange to plug holes in the balance sheet. And that was criminal. It's a separate question, which we discuss the extent to which it was venal, but it was definitely criminal. He went bust. He got arrested. He was put on trial. He was convicted. And he was sentenced to 25 years. Just recently, his former business partner and girlfriend, Caroline Ellison, who testified against him in his trial, was sentenced to 2 years. The rise and fall of Sam Bankman-Fried is a really fascinating story, and Michael Lewis had access to it, really, that you can't believe, and he still has access to Sam Bankman-Fried in jail. But it's interesting for us, I think, for this podcast, because it is also the story of a philosophy that has its roots in utilitarianism. Its name is effective altruism, and that is where this conversation starts. Michael, before you met Sam Bankman-Fried, had you come across effective altruism as a movement? Did you know anything about it?
I had not heard the phrase. What I had encountered, just occasionally and accidentally, were stories of young people who had left Ivy League schools to go to work on Wall Street to make money to give it away. And I can remember when this was. I was working on Flash Boys, which was a 2013-14 kind of period. I was bumping up against high-frequency trading firms, which were new. I didn't even really know what they were. I was learning what they were. And it was just a name or two was thrown out. Like this odd thing happened. We had this kid who came into our firm. He went to Princeton, and he came explicitly to make as much money as possible so he could give it away. And I remember thinking, that's an odd thing. And I traced it at the time. I remember tracing it back to Peter Singer, who was a professor of philosophy at Princeton, Australian, who is the kind of the founding father of effective altruism. But so that was it. That was all I'd heard. And the first time I hear the phrase effective altruism is when I'm taking Sam Bankman-Fried on a walk to figure out who he is. But so no, it was new to me.
Did he say, I am My name's Sam and I'm an effective altruist. How did he characterize the philosophy?
I was asking him how he got into the world of money in the first place, because he seemed, this is September of 2021. This is innocent days. And I was with him in the first place, not because I was going to write about him. I was with him because a friend had asked me to evaluate him because my friend was thinking about doing a business deal with him, a several $100 million business deal. And so it was a social encounter. And about 10 minutes into this social encounter, it was clear he was not like most Wall Street people. He was odd. And also just, and this is going to sound strange given what's happening, but not a money person. He was just interested in everything else. And so the question just arose, like, how on earth did you, child of two Stanford law professors who's interested chiefly first in physics and math and board games and goes to MIT, how did you even end up in crypto? And it was through finance. It was through high frequency trading. And the reason he said he'd been attracted to finance was this thing he had come to believe, which was effective altruism. And he explained it with very light touch. He wasn't selling me a religion. He was just explaining it to me as he explained it to an idiot. And the story went something like this, that this movement had come out of utilitarianism and that it had been shaped by 3 Oxford professors into a call for action. And the idea was, and the framing of it's so interesting to me, the way he framed it, there was no pause to actually consider the framing, because the framing was, you live your life, a good life, to minimize the suffering of others and maximize the happiness. But actually, this quickly gets turned into maximize the number of lives or life years you save of other people, which is it is not an intuitive thing. Like the way you're supposed to live your life is to save other people's lives. But it's a framing that ends up being quite useful to the effective altruist because it enables you to start quantifying things. If you're making decisions between courses of action or how to give money away, you're all of a sudden able to say, well, this will save 50,000 lives and this will save 60,000 lives, so we'll do the latter. And this appealed to a certain kind of person, a quantitative person who wanted to be able to have that kind of rational argument about what one should do with one's life. So he starts by explaining that. This is sort of like what got his juices flowing when he was 15, 16, 17, 18 years old.
So when I came across effective altruism before I'd heard of Sam Bankman-Fried, because like you said, it's partly an Oxford thing. And I associated it with 2 ideas, one which he embodies in a way, and you can see it on some of their literature, like their website, where they kind of advise young people how they should spend their lives. And the thought is, if you're really smart, you instinctively, and you want to do good in the world, you instinctively feel that you can do most good by finding a good organization to work for and apply your smarts to the working of that organization. And the effective altruists say, no, mistake. You can find a bad organization like a Wall Street trading firm, make shitloads of money, and then use your smarts to allocate the money smartly, because most good organizations are massively inefficient. And there's a question about that, which I'll come on to. But then the other thing that they were associated with was what's come known as the existential risk movement, which is this idea that once you're doing the utilitarian calculation, there is one thing that outweighs everything else, which is human extinction, an extinction level event. And, at that point, all bets are off. So you prioritize avoiding the worst outcome. What's interesting to me about Sam, as you described him, Sam Bankman-Fried, is he very much fits the first template. But it's not clear he was one of the second. There's the notorious quote from Caroline Ellison that seemed to be the thing that the judge sentenced him to that length of period in time for, which was when she said, Sam's the kind of guy who would flip a coin, essentially. And if one way you get the destruction of the human race, but the other way you double the happiness, he would go for it.
So he was atypical in a couple of ways. The movement sort of jumps the shark, in my view, when it moves away from saving poor people in Africa from dying of malaria to
sort of Bill Gates view of the world.
View of the world. And there's actually a lot of interaction between Gates and the effective altruist community. They knew each other. But is when they turn to existential risk, which is when Sam discovers the movement in 2012, or the movement discovers Sam. And the argument he hears is, look, okay, you could make as much money as possible on Wall Street and give it away to maximize the number of current lives you save, or you can address existential risk. And the existential risks are, meteors hitting the earth, or pandemics wiping out the species, or AI slipping its leash and eating us all, or whatever AI is going to do. And anything you do to defray the risk, anything to reduce the risk even slightly, is going to far outweigh in import anything you could do with current lives. So it turns a lot of people who might have been focused on like just minimizing the suffering around us to this different kind of problem, because as much as they strain to do it, it's very hard to judge the probabilities of these events. I mean, but the math gets fun for them. So Sam at first buys into this, but Sam was always more of this world in some ways than some of the people around him. And he starts thinking thoughts like, well, what really am I, Sam Bankman-Fried, going to do all by myself to prevent a devastating pandemic? I'm going to need a government to do that for me. What government is going to be the most manipulable and the most powerful, most effective? The United States government. What's the greatest threat to the United States government? Donald Trump. So all of a sudden he's in a space in his head where his greatest use is preventing Donald Trump from becoming president, which are thoughts that the effective altruist community has stayed far clear of. So instantly he's more of this kind of world. He's mixing it up with people who are outside the EA movement much more naturally than EA people are.
But do you think one of the things that happened, as you said, on the more conventional EA approach, you do the math, you calculate the lives saved, this amount of money will save this number of lives, this amount of money will save these, and if we steer it this way rather than this way. Once you get into existential risk, the math is more fun, but it's much looser.
Much looser.
And it's not clear how much money you need. And in your telling of the story, it feels like there is a deferral of the moment of truth, which is we've got enough money to save the world, because you never know when you have enough money to save the world. And they certainly had moved away from the idea, right, now we've got $10 billion. There is a lot of good we could do with that. When you're thinking about the future of the world, $10 billion is nothing.
Right, that's right.
Is this part of the corruption here?
Yes, it is part of the corruption. It means that all of a sudden we're not trying to make $10 billion, we're trying to make $1 trillion.
Yeah.
And it caused tension within his small circle, even at FTX, that the small circle of effective altruists who ran the place were in constant argument and tension about what they should be doing now versus what they should be doing later. And Sam's view was always, we're in money-making mode. Okay, we could do some stuff now, but it looked like they were generating wealth at such an incredible rate that why bother spending a lot of time giving it away? And some of the others, it's not that they didn't give some money away, but it was just the philanthropic arm of FTX was a smaller part of the activity than anyone would have imagined before they started if they'd known how much money they had at their disposal. And that really bothered some of the people around Sam. It was like, when is now? When do we start giving away?
When is enough?
But having said that, I sat in on a couple of their meetings where they were giving some money away. And it was chicken feed by their standards, but a couple $100 million. And in defense of the movement, it was interesting to watch people think about philanthropy. It is true that an awful lot of giving by rich people isn't really giving. It's like they're giving into the museum so they can have their name on the building. And is the museum really the place you want to give kind of thing? And they're not thinking. They're just thinking it's status moves. It's like, I'm doing this to enhance my status rather than to make the world a better place. Quite a bit of that. And there's also people in their philanthropic lives, people who are quite ruthless in their business lives, get very loose in their thinking in their philanthropic lives. They'll do things that they just never would do in their business lives. And to watch these kids who had virtually unlimited sums of money at their fingertips say, look, let's not create an institution that is like other philanthropies, which is the institution ends up being more about itself than the philanthropy, where if you got to have a huge, massive team of people to evaluate every proposal and so on and so forth, it becomes about just the thing. Let's just give the money. We know what we want to give it to. We know the areas. We know we're interested in pandemic prevention and figuring out how to prevent AI from becoming lethal and so on and so forth. And we know there are people out there who know a lot more than we do about what might be done to move the world forward a little bit. Let's just send them an email with $1 million and say, here, give this away in the smartest way possible. So I thought that's an interesting idea. And if FTX had not collapsed and I had written a different sort of book, one piece of that book was going to be trying to follow what happened to those grants, because I did do a bit of interviewing, and it was really interesting. And it was small grants. It was $50,000 to this professor at Arizona State University so he could teach a little less and think a bit more about the problem. And you knew that money was going to have some effect. And they really thought about this. So it wasn't that the giving was insincere. It was just minimized in a way that was surprising given where they started. If you told all these people when they were 22 years old that they were going to have $20 billion they could give away or $10 billion, they'd say we'd be giving that money away. Instead, Sam Bankman-Fried was saying, I'm going to turn the $10 billion into $1 trillion. And then the question was, where does it stop? I mean, I think that the answer was probably never.
Before we get back to Sam Bankman-Fried, I just want to connect this question to what you're currently working on, the project that you've just started publishing in the Washington Post, which comes out of the book that we talked about last time we spoke, which was The Fifth Risk, which is about the good work that's done deep inside the United States government, and most, maybe all, citizens are unaware of it. If you look at the effective altruists' literature, they do consider the possibility. They basically say, don't go and work for a big NGO or a charity, because that is kind of a waste of your time if you're smart. But there is a possibility that government is the place you should be, though more plausibly making money and then directing it is the thing that you should do. Did these people consider, when they were thinking about an effective use of the money that they'd made, that the effective use might be finding people in government? So there's giving Donald Trump $5 billion not to run for president. That's the kind of cartoon version of this. But the stuff that you're currently writing about and that you wrote about in The Fifth Risk is, if you're an effective altruist, it is at least plausible. If you read The Fifth Risk, you might think the most effective thing we could do would be to find the people inside government. If you want to worry about the future of the human race, it is possible that government is where the answers lie. But that's not on the whole part of the philosophy of these kind of kids. Did you ever see an overlap, or is there just a kind of gap between the good that can be done in government, which is there, if you've got the eyes to see it, you can see it, and the view of these people that you will find a professor somewhere here or a little sort of scrappy startup somewhere here, and they're the people who'll save the human race?
This was Sam Bankman-Fried's original contribution to the movement, was to say that actually we need to pay attention to government, which of course, the minute you start paying attention to government with huge sums of money, you're instantly controversial, right?
Government is interested in you.
And government is interested in you. So it may be the start of his problems that he took such an interest in government. Government and politics. He had an enterprise in Washington, D.C. that was run by his brother that was ostensibly and largely was devoted to improving U.S. pandemic response, both by educating existing legislators and by getting people elected who were interested in the subject. And they did crazy stuff. I mean, they paid for the campaign of a fellow effective altruist who had absolutely no talent for politics. His expertise was pandemic prevention. And they thought, we get one such person in the Congress and he'll be the subject matter expert and will have huge effects within government. His name was Carrick Flynn. And he was kind of a carpetbagger. They kind of sent him back to a new district in Oregon to run for office. Gave him $10 million. They made it the most expensive primary, I think, in the country at the time, and one of the most expensive ever. And they spent $10 million and he got 10% of the vote. But they never stopped to ask, could this person actually function as a politician? And he had a couple of traits that were just crippling. And one was he was highly sensitive to any kind of criticism. So he'd get very upset when anybody said anything kind of like negative about him and behave oddly. And the second was, he's just tone deaf. So yes, I think that what set Sam Bankman-Fried apart a bit from his movement was he said, yes, government is a tool for this. But he was thinking of government as politics, as opposed to government as civil service. But this is something not just Sam, but my society at least, completely misses. That everybody in the United States now, when you talk to them about government, they think you're talking about politics. There's so little understanding of what the civil service does and how important it is and how it is this reservoir of expertise for dealing with these intractable problems. I tried to talk to Sam about it. I said, actually, they're organizations that are trying to improve the civil service. You ought to talk to them. And he wasn't interested.
Because that's what, so you'd think if you were an effective altruist, the mistake that they made of getting an amateur into politics is the thing they're always warning against. Like they're saying, you've got to find the right location for your talents. But The other version, if you think of it as politics, is also unpalatable, which is find the most skillful politician and give that person money. Then you end up in a room with a senator or a congressman and you do conventional kind of lobbying or funding politics. Whereas the third option, the one that you were trying to raise, feels like it is the effective altruist approach. And yet it was off the table for them. So he did, he was also in the room with Mitch McConnell and stuff, right? So he did a bit of the first and a bit of the second. But why the blind spot about the third?
I think it isn't just his blind spot. I think, not wrongly, he thought that the only way you improve the government is through the politicians, that eventually you're going to be dealing with politics. It's very hard to directly influence the civil service with your money. The thing is, I actually think it's possible. There are nonprofits that are devoted to buttressing the civil service and have got bipartisan support. There are ways to create programs to attract talent into government, that kind of thing. Even when I tried to educate him about this, because I learned a bit about these organizations when I was working on The Fifth Risk, his mind was elsewhere. I think he thought he'd already strayed pretty far from his movement taking an interest in politics. He was already in a kind of controversial situation with other effective altruists by trying to prevent Donald Trump from being president. So it was maybe the bridge too far for him.
Was it also, you describe it, he had an innate resistance to, if this is the way that it's been done, I'm not just going to put money into that, I'm going to think it through for myself. And the thing about government is that a lot of it is already built.
That's right.
And he also had a resistance to older people telling him this is how we do it. And again, if you encounter government in that form, you can find sexy young politicians, but on the whole, when you encounter bureaucrats, you're encountering experienced people, some of whom are very effective and very smart, but they don't fit that template, which is our job as effective altruists is to think this thing through from first principles. And he was a quintessential version of that kind of EA, wasn't he?
So there are a couple of things there. One is, let's just say you and I had billions of dollars and we were going to try to improve the United States government without the help of elected officials. That we weren't going to go through the politics route. We were going to find ways to attract really smart people to the Department of Energy kind of thing. That's a slow and grinding task.
Yeah.
So just for starters. And it can be really unclear for a very long time what effects we've had, if any. So I think that's probably it would be his first response. But also true that he probably looked at government and said, it is a collection of people doing things the way they've always been done, and this is uninteresting to me. Much faster to get someone who is like-minded into Congress and have them start doing things that haven't been done before. And he did have a point that if you're dealing with specifically pandemic prevention, I mean, there's a thing that's obvious to do that the United States government is uniquely suited to do because it has the resources. And it has to really probably be done inside of government, but requires international collaboration. There really needs to be a kind of global weather service for disease prediction, the way we do weather prediction. Governments collaborate, they share information, there's modeling. If you monitored hospitals around the world for new pathogens or versions of old pathogens, you start to build predictive models about where we should worry about things and where we shouldn't. And with like maybe $10 billion, the United States government could launch this thing. And that's one of the things they were interested in doing. Very hard to see how you do that without the government. And I think Sam thought, if I can just get in the ears of people who can allocate the resources of the government, I'll save myself the trouble of having to make the $10 billion and give it away. So I could see why he was thinking the way he was thinking. And I don't think he was completely wrong. But it, for me, is a little frustrating just because I'd been working on this project where you could see the effects of these people who, if they just got given a little more help within the government, maybe they could solve problems, the kind of problems he wanted solved.
And since we mentioned it, the Washington Post series that you're doing now is a version of that, right?
It's a version of that. So The Fifth Risk, the book I wrote about the Trump administration's basically disinterest in the federal government, led me to kind of just wander around places in the federal government that nobody pays any attention to. And people who think of themselves as politically savvy or interested in American politics, you ask them like what the Department of Agriculture does, they have no idea. And it's kind of the important question. And I was struck back then when I wrote that book, how rich the material was. I mean, how many kind of smart, mission-driven people there were inside the government working on problems that were extremely important and that the private sector wasn't going to tackle. And it's sometimes very small problems, like one of my favorite characters in The Fifth Risk, Coast Guard oceanographer, who figures out that lots of people are lost at sea, who are lost at sea die, because even though the Coast Guard knows where they were lost and knows how long they've been lost for, they didn't know how they drifted at sea because different objects drift differently. And he studied how objects drifted at sea and improved the ability of the Coast Guard to locate people. And thousands of people have been saved because of that. Little things like that.
Very effective, not altruism, very effective bureaucracy.
Yeah. This is a person who's he will save thousands and thousands of lives with this technology he created. There are people like that all over the United States government. So I thought it would be interesting to drop other writers into the government, see what they found that interested them. And so we curated this series. It's 6 other writers, 1 Englishman, London Review of Books man, John Lanchester, did one of the pieces. And a couple of things fell out of this series, and it's running every week in the Washington Post until the election now. One was just how quickly all the writers found their subject. They couldn't believe just how subject-rich the government was. They, like a lot of the population, thought, well, it's kind of a boring gray mass. The second was that how inept the government is at telling its story, that you go in and you find a character. I mean, the character I wrote about is a guy who's devoted his life to preventing coal mine roofs from falling into the heads of coal miners. And that's something that's killed 50,000 American miners in the 20th century, coal mine roof collapse. I mean, it was not a trivial problem. And his story is a breathtakingly interesting story. But to tell it, I had to navigate an army of communications people who would rather me not be there. There's just like the government has become viscerally afraid of any kind of scrutiny because the scrutiny historically has always ended badly for them. It's like if anybody's turning up to ask questions about what's going on in the government, it's usually because they want to attack it. And so there's been this kind of hostile relationship between people who want to tell stories and the people in the government. And the people in the government themselves, they're kind of the opposite of Donald Trump. Very effective at doing really important work, but then are just very uncomfortable bragging about it. I mean, they're just modest beyond belief. I mean, when I found, for example, the fellow in the Coast Guard who figured out how objects drifted and who has saved thousands of lives, and his story is great, I went and spent 3 days with him. And when I was finished with him, he must not have listened very closely when I called him in the first place. When I was finished with him, he called me up and he says, hey, you're a writer. And I said, yeah, I'm a writer. And he said, my son says, like, your books get turned into movies and like you might be kind of big time. And he says, are you going to write about me? And I said, yeah, why else you think I spent 3 days with you? He said, I thought you were just really interested in how objects drifted. And that happens over and over. It's like they don't have any sense of themselves as characters and they aren't self-promotional. They're just kind of interested in the thing they're doing. So the stories don't get told. But the point of the Post series was to tell a few of the stories and try to sort of create an antidote. I mean, people, at least the people in my country, when you say government employee or bureaucrat, their mind instantly goes to boring, deep state, corrupt, inefficient, lazy. It's just that story has been sold so hard. It is a stereotype that I wanted to break it up a little bit. And all the stories do that. They create a different picture in your head when you think government worker now. And you think someone who's actually mission-driven, expert, self-effacing, effective, because there's a lot of that in government.
So when I hear you say that, it does make me feel what you've just described is not a million miles away from some aspects of the mindset that Sam Bankman-Fried and some of the people he worked with tried to embody. But there are 2 big differences here. We'll come on to the second, which is he was not averse to publicity. But the first is that, as we've talked about it, I mean, people who are not familiar with effective altruism might think it's a little weird or a bit kooky, but it's not crazy. I think you describe it in the book as intellectually defensible but socially unacceptable. At the trial, particularly when he was giving evidence, but also when Caroline Ellison and others were giving evidence about him, it came across as grotesque, as a kind of monstrous philosophy, and him as a kind of monster.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, as you make clear, this is primarily because of the way in which he seemed to have an attitude to risk, and risk as it applied to other people. And what's interesting about that is this has always been the criticism of utilitarianism. You know, the classic criticism of utilitarianism is it treats people as means and not ends. They are just data points in the vast calculating machine of human happiness. From Bentham onwards, this was the attack. And utilitarians have had all sorts of ways that they've tried to push back against it. Sam embodied that line of attack. And he then, in his own defense, kind of doubled down on it. And it was his attitude to risk.
And to people.
And to people that made what may or may not be an intellectually defensible philosophy completely socially unacceptable. Is that right?
I think that is right. I think first it's his attitude to people. Even he would acknowledge he doesn't feel much for other people. It's a curious question why someone who his whole life has had trouble forming any kind of human bond would devote his life to trying to maximize other people's happiness. He's indifferent to other people's happiness. He's indifferent to his own. He acknowledges that he feels no happiness, that incapable of feeling happiness, incapable of empathy. It's a curious place for someone like that to land, that I'm going to devote my life because it makes sense, intellectual sense to him, that the purpose of my life is maximizing other people's lives or maximizing the number of life years or happy life years on earth. It's strange. It's not felt. It's like thought. I mean, it's thought that he's having those thoughts when he's 15, 16, 17 years old. He's quite sincere about it. It isn't something he just sort of pasted on himself to disguise the fact he wanted to go and rob a lot of people of their savings. And that's not what happened. I think that Sam was misunderstood when FTX collapsed. His character was seen as the character of a thief. That what he had done was kind of like what Bernie Madoff had done or countless Wall Street people had done. That he wanted money and he just taken other people's money. And I thought that just kind of missed the point of his vice. His vice, it was about risk. It was his willingness to subject other people to risk without asking their permission. This trait ran right through his existence on this planet, that he did it in his romantic life, that he had over and over girls kind of fall in love with him. He would not emotionally commit, but at the same time get them too. But they'd put their hearts on the line and he would have nothing on the line.
Means not ends.
That's right. And he did it, I mean, trivial-wise. He'd do it with people's time. Like I would say, I'm coming down to spend a week with you in the Bahamas. Yes, come on down. And I'd land and say, I changed my mind. I've got to go to wherever. And you were never part of the calculation. It was like there was a calculation being made, the inconvenience or the price to you of the risk he was taking by preserving his optionality to do whatever he wanted to do at any time was not factored in. But he did it with people's money. What he did inside his business was take these customer deposits, and he didn't take them and spend them on luxury items. He took them and invested them, put them at risk. Now, it turned out he put them at risk in very intelligent ways, and the returns have been quite good, and everybody's going to get their money back. But never mind that.
He didn't ask permission.
He didn't ask permission. And he thought he sort of had permission. And in addition, he sort of prided himself on being what he would say risk neutral, that most people, he would say, are risk averse, that the more you have, the less likely you want to put it at risk. And he would say, look, even if I have $1 trillion, if you give me a bet that has got positive expected value and lay all $1 trillion on the line, I'll do it. And he prided himself on that. And I wondered always with him, okay, that may make sense to you mathematically. That may make sense in the context of a Wall Street trading firm where you are one of 1,000 traders who are making small bets on behalf of the firm. And your job is to find the positive expected value, the coin that's slightly weighted in your favor, and flip it as much as possible. But you're one of 1,000, and your bets all by yourself are not going to bankrupt the firm. But when you're essentially putting your entire firm at risk over and over and over, eventually the coins, even if it's weighted in your favor, is going to land in the wrong spot and you're going to go down. And that's kind of what happened with him. So the attitude towards risk was it at once unsettled other people and it unsettled the judge. It's true. The judge thought that if I let you loose in the world, you'll find other ways to do this. And so I have to disable you and put you away for 25 years. As a part of that evaluation of Sam, the judge also said, I don't think you're particularly interested in money, which is a very interesting thing to say to someone who he's accusing of stealing $11 billion of other people's money. He says, I don't think money was the motive. And I think he was right about that. But it also, that attitude towards risk, thrilled the financial community. Like venture capitalists were attracted to him. They liked that he wasn't going to dial it back when he got to $1 trillion. They liked this risk-taking, what looked like a risk-loving approach to business and life.
In the new afterword that you've written to the book, you touch on the question, and I'm sure people listening to this will have had this thought as you describe him, his temperament, the way he thinks, this kind of affectless quality. He doesn't experience pleasure, sees other people as part of a larger calculation. It sounds, one term for it would be neurodivergent. Another more specific term is it sounds like he has Asperger's or some equivalent. And it did make me think of the fact that there's a lot that's been written about this. The founding father of utilitarianism, Jeremy Bentham, is thought to have had Asperger's. Bentham seems to have had some of those qualities, and he couldn't read human emotions. He admitted this. He didn't understand. Every human face was a mask to him. And so he wanted a system of language which allowed him to strip out the ambiguity. So he came up with this insanely complicated language for talking about politics and utility so that people couldn't do what human beings do, which is nonverbal signals and other ways of talking. But the two things that made me think of Sam Bankman-Fried is, one, by all accounts, Bentham had a huge capacity for joy. He was actually a joyful person, which Sam wasn't. But you say in your afterword, one of the reasons you think he doesn't fit some of the classic descriptions of Asperger's is he had a deep sense of irony, which Bentham did too, actually. Bentham completely could see this world in all of its ironies, but he then wanted to strip them out. So how did Sam's sense of irony, so he didn't have a sense of joy that Bentham had.
What tickled him was human irrationality, human behavior. He was a pretty acute observer of other people. So he would come from a meeting with Mitch McConnell. He'd be vastly amused that you couldn't call him Mitch. You needed to call him Dear Leader or Sir Leader or Leader Sir. The ceremony around Mitch McConnell, he found preposterous and funny. He was just aware of the comic dimension of life. He saw other people's behavior as amusing. It's funny. When I picture him in my head describing the folly of others, I don't picture him laughing.
Yeah, I was going to say it's sort of joyless amusement.
It's joyless amusement is what it feels like. He just saw it and noted it and saw that it was funny. And everything that came out of his mouth had a kind of humor to it. Sometimes a kind of a caustic humor. But it wasn't this flat affect. You didn't feel you were with that. You were with someone who was alive to other people's emotional life and other people's irrationality, even if he himself didn't get a lot of pleasure out of it. When I moved through the world with Sam Bankman-Fried, even if he wasn't laughing, I was laughing all the time. He found himself in and was aware of preposterous situation after preposterous situation. And it's a curious thing, creating lots of humor, but without himself getting a lot of pleasure in the humor.
When I read the story as you describe it, the other moment that I thought was, I don't know if corruption is the right word, but when things potentially started to go wrong for him, and this relates to what you've just said about moving through the world with someone who saw the ridiculousness of it. One of the systems that he tried to think through for himself was the system of celebrity and where the value was. Now, they had all this money, and one of the things they notoriously did was they sort of hosed it at very famous people in order to promote the FTX brand. And he looked at the system of celebrity, and this was probably a correct calculation, worked out that it was a kind of winner-take-all world, in that you could hose this money at very, very famous people, and it had almost no effect. But if you hosted at Tom Brady or Taylor Swift or whoever, and he became one of those people, in a sense that at the moment of his peak influence, it was all about him. It was about the hair, it was about the look, it was about the brand. He became the brand. And it's almost like he calculated this was the correct thing to happen, but it was catastrophic as well.
It was catastrophic, but it was also accidental. So people make the mistake of going back and thinking that everything was much more planned than it was. When they started, he left his Jane Street trading job to start a crypto trading firm, which was meant to be private. And he would have been perfectly happy if no one ever knew it existed, but it was going to make a fortune arbitraging crypto prices. And then they realized that they need an exchange to trade on that's more professional than the exchanges that exist. So they write the software for this exchange and try to get other exchanges to buy it so they can trade on it. And the reason they don't first think, oh, we're going to create a crypto exchange is it was an outward-facing business. It was a business where you had to go promote it, where the person who created it would have to be a known person and have to interact with other people and sell. And Sam thought himself incapable of doing such a thing. He thought that there was no way that like people would buy him as the front person for any kind of business because he hadn't had any friends in his life, much less like sold anybody anything. And so the fact that he became this character in everybody's imagination and that the most valuable thing for FTX was for him to go on the television was bewildering to him in the beginning. But it happened. And it's kind of interesting that they didn't see that that would work, that they didn't see that him being peculiar was actually going to be a huge advantage. The minute he went on TV and was just different from anything anybody had seen on TV, kind of authentic in his way, it had a powerful effect on the business. And it turned out he was quite good at marketing and selling by not marketing and selling. What happened at the trial was the prosecutors framed this as, oh, he sort of played up all his odd traits because he saw how well it played with the audience. But he didn't have to. He had all those odd traits. The audience just liked those odd traits, completely to his surprise. But that's right. He ends up being the face of the business. He ends up being a global celebrity. And as a result, when things go bad, he takes all the blame.
The deep mystery in many ways is why he didn't put up a better defense. There are two questions, and you address them both. One of which is there were ways out of the mess that he was in, and he didn't take them.
Yes. They crossed two lines. I mean, they crossed many little lines, but two big red lines. When they opened their crypto exchange, when FTX was open, no bank would bank them, which meant that if you, David, wanted to put your money, and crypto exchanges act as custodians of the customers. They're not like stock exchanges. So you send your pounds or your dollars in, and they sit on the exchange. They're supposed to warehouse them in cold storage, and you use your dollars to buy crypto, and the crypto, they warehouse that. So you need a bank to facilitate that. It's something that someone will transfer dollars and pounds into and out of crypto. And no bank would do it because crypto was toxic. The banks didn't want the risk of having the relationship with people who bought and sold crypto. But Sam's little private hedge fund, Alameda Research, did have banks. So the way they ended up getting around not being able to get banks is they just used Alameda Research bank accounts. So instead of sending the money into FTX, you actually wired the money to various entities that were controlled by Alameda Research. So the money's in the wrong place to start with. Now, it's important to note that the people who are wiring the money in the first place, since this exchange was created for kind of professional grade traders, were some of the most sophisticated financial people on the planet. It was jump trading and Hudson River trading. And no one has really asked why it didn't bother them that they were wiring the money to the wrong place. It was an open secret, I think, that the money was in the wrong place. But it was just assumed that the money wouldn't be used. Like it would sit there inertly the way it would sit inertly on FTX. And money's fungible. As long as the pile of money inside of Alameda Research of liquid assets is greater than the customer deposits, you would say that the customer deposits were all there. But there's a lot of other things in that pile in Alameda Research, including by June of 2022, $10 billion in loans from crypto banks. And in June of 2022, there was a crash in the crypto markets. The crypto bankers got spooked. They asked for their $10 billion back. And the only way that that money could be repaid by Sam Bankman-Fried was by dipping into the customer deposits. So that's where he crosses a line of, I'm using my customer deposits.
Without telling
them. And he could have at that point said to the crypto banks, sorry, I took your crypto loans and I made venture capital investments with them and they're illiquid and it's there. You're just going to have to wait. But he didn't do that.
Or you can call them in and Alameda could go bust.
Yes, that's right.
But FTX survives.
Right? FTX survives.
And if Alameda goes bust, Sam Bankman-Fried doesn't end up in jail. He's had a failed business.
He's had a failed business. FTX would have taken at least a short-term blow because everybody would have worried about it. But people like trading on it. And the business, the real business was that it was a casino for crypto. It was a place where people like to speculate in crypto. And the way the business made money was taking a little piece of every transaction. It was a simple business.
So why didn't he say to the people when they came calling for their loans back, these are your choices?
So this is a great question, and a question that the trial really didn't completely address. The deeper why of it. And I don't know, but I think he was so invested in both his idea of himself as the world's shrewdest trader and the appearance of this enormous success over the past, his whole identity had changed, that he couldn't stomach actually saying, I didn't know what I was doing or it was sloppy, that it was almost, this isn't quite right, almost a kind of social embarrassment. That's what I think was going on. The story he told himself, I think, the story he told the public is that he didn't know that there wasn't enough money in there to pay all the customer deposits, that he didn't know that he was effectively borrowing $11 billion and that's implausible.
But he would rather plead ignorance than stupidity.
That's right. But I think the truth is that he made a calculation and he didn't think that large numbers of customers would come and ask for their money back right away, that he had it invested in stuff that was going to pay off pretty big time, and that time would just solve the problem, is what I think he thought.
Which we should say it has. That's the other thing.
That's the thing. So let's just...
If he'd bought himself some time, he would be fine now.
Yeah, assuming he didn't do more dumb things. Assuming that he hadn't just, he hadn't thought, well, I got away with it this long. I'll use even more of the customer deposits, or I'll make even more reckless investments. Assuming he'd been frightened enough by the close brush with death that he changed his behavior, yes, that nobody would know.
Because we should say now, everybody has been paid back.
So the way to measure what's happened is when FTX collapsed in November of 2022, instantly a market emerged for claims. If you had $1,000 on FTX, you could sell that claim to some hedge fund for, at the time, maybe 5 cents on the dollar. So people thought that at best they were going to get 5 cents on the dollar back.
That's what they were being told by the people who had been brought in to look at the books.
That's right. That's right. Who didn't really know what they were sitting on. And now those claims, people are about to actually be paid back very soon. But the claims are still trading, and they're trading at 125 cents on the dollar. So that the claims are more valuable. The people are going to get their money back plus some. And the question is, how much is some? So yes, it certainly didn't have to play out the way it played out. There is a world in which there's never a run on FTX, but they are aware of how close they came to that happening. They change their behavior, and they start to unwind slowly these assets they've acquired. And they put the money back in FTX, and no one is ever wiser about what happened. That could have happened. I think it's a little unlikely, because I think if Sam had wriggled out of that situation, he would have found another way to take risk with other people's money. I think that he's sort of wired that way, but I could be wrong.
Then the second question is, how did he end up getting sentenced to 25 years in jail, in the sense that he took the stand against the advice of his lawyers? He was a catastrophic witness. It's almost like he went out of his way to alienate the judge.
The judge said in the sentencing, he said he's never seen anything like this in his 30 years on the bench.
So in a way, to go back to where we started, here's a guy whose philosophy is about calculating risk and expected value. He has a weird personality, which means he's also indifferent to risk.
Mm-hmm.
But despite being indifferent to risk, he's also all about calculating probabilities and likely outcomes and which course of action is likely to deliver value. And he miscalculated this one spectacularly, badly. Is it in the end to do with the indifference, or is it the arrogance? What was going on there?
It's a gumbo of problems, or traits that are all problems. But trait number one is when some grown-up expert tells Sam Bankman-Fried, this is how it is, Sam Bankman-Fried's first reaction is, no, it's not. I don't believe you, or I don't trust it, or I'm going to think about it myself. So the grown-up experts were all telling him, his lawyers were saying, it's a really bad idea for you to testify. And he said, I think I know better. That's just part of who he is.
Even though he knew he was going to be lying on the stand, because he wasn't going to admit that he knew. Or had he convinced himself he wasn't actually lying?
I think he probably convinced himself he wasn't actually lying. But the second thing that was going on is he had this view that he expressed to me several times, that when he thought about his life, all the value was going to be in the first 40 years, because nobody after the age of 40 did much of anything. And so that he had to move fast when young. So the difference to Sam between a sentence of 7 or 8 years and 30 years was, in his mind, not a big deal, because those other years didn't have great expected value.
And he wasn't going to be happy anyway. So
he wasn't going to be happy anyway. So but there's another thing. This is a kind of endearing quality in him. It's why it's not hard, if you know him, to feel some sympathy, and why all the people around him, even the people who were most harmed by his behavior, have trouble hating him or being really, really angry at him for long. He has zero self-preservatory instincts. that he was incredibly easy to steal from. He was very easy to take advantage of. He was unwary in the extreme about risk to his self, personal risk. Like he was a person who at one point Forbes said was worth $22 billion, and he drove himself to work every day without any kind of security. He was so easy to kidnap. And the greatest fear a lot of his colleagues had for a year and a half was that someone was going to kidnap Sam and demand $3 billion in crypto ransom. And it would have been so easy to do. He was very vulnerable all the time to kind of smash and grab journalism. Like people would come in, he just let them in. Like he let me in. He wasn't this diabolical mastermind. He was just vulnerable and open. And he was unbelievably easy to prosecute. It's not a death wish exactly, but it's a numbness to risk. He doesn't feel the kind of things that make the hair on the back of your neck stand up when you sense someone's about to do something bad to you. He doesn't feel it. He doesn't feel it. And so he went through the entire prosecution without that felt they're coming to get me kind of thing. Like I've got to protect myself. I think that left him open to behaving the way he would behave, because I think a normal person would behave the way that all his colleagues behaved and do whatever they could to minimize the sentence. And he wasn't really thinking about that. I think what he was thinking is he would get on the stand and he'd be able to tell a big, broad story. And he got on the stand, and you don't do that in a courtroom. The judge and the prosecutor stop you from saying very much at all except answering the question in a very narrow way. And he came across, I was there when he was testifying, he came across, never mind whether he perjured himself, like whether he actually perjured himself. He did. But even if he hadn't, he came across as so dishonest because he refused to remember anything about his life. The most trivial details. They'd ask, did you fly on a private jet to the Super Bowl? The long silence. I don't recall. Now, I was on the jet with him. I recall. I could tell you what he ate on the jet. There's no way he doesn't recall. Do you recall having dinner with President Bill Clinton and the Prime Minister of the Bahamas? Might have happened. I don't know. And there was that over and over and over. And you could see that the jury, the whole courtroom was very aware this person was not forthcoming, which was exactly what his problem was financially. He just showed them the person that would do such a thing. And it felt almost deliberate. It clearly wasn't, but it felt almost deliberate. It was so bad you started to feel sorry for him.
But the judge thought he was almost being deliberately provoked by this guy, right?
The judge was furious.
Yeah, the judge thought he'd never come across someone who was taking the piss out of him.
Yeah, that's right. It was almost comedy if it wasn't so tragic. If Monty Python staged a trial and the goal was to get sentenced as long as possible, this is how they would behave. He did it. He maxed out. I don't think there's anything he could have done to get a longer sentence. And when the judge sentenced him, he said, you're being punished for perjuring yourself, kind of. And I've never seen anybody do what you did on a witness stand. And I'm afraid of you. Your way of moving through the world, I've got to prevent you from being out there because you'll do other bad things.
Last question. You still have some contact with him?
He's in a cell in the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn. He hasn't been assigned to a prison yet. He's in jail. And it's the cell where they keep prisoners who would be at risk in the larger population.
It's a larger prison population.
Right. And it's an exotic collection of people. It's the former president of Honduras and the former attorney general of Mexico and the 3 former assassins from various drug cartels. And now 2 bunks next to him is Puff Daddy, P. Diddy, Sean Combs. And I am in touch with him. I visited once in person, and there's an email system so I can communicate with him. And I think he's going to start publishing a prison diary. His writing is a lot like being with him in person. He's capable of, at the same time, shockingly original insight and banality. And he doesn't distinguish the two very well, but I'm sure it'll be an interesting prison diary.
Is it possible to say at this point, given the way his mind works and given that he wants to understand how things play out in the world, the lesson that he would have taken from his experience? I mean, presumably he acknowledges he made a mistake by taking the stand, or maybe he doesn't. Is there much, do you think, self-reflection about the experience of the last year, or is it just now a fact about the world that he's serving 25 years and he responds as Sam does, which is it's another fact to take account of?
It's another fact to take account of. He's unchanged. You sit down with him and you would never guess what he's endured. His parents aren't that way. His parents seem just completely crushed. And you see it on their faces. Sam's mind, Sam's demeanor, just unchanged. It is a fact about the world that this happened. And he doesn't say things. And I don't think he probably even thinks them like, oh, I really shouldn't have done that. I really shouldn't have taken the stand. I wish I hadn't done it. Nothing like that.
He doesn't do regret.
No, he doesn't do regret. He does. That didn't turn out like I thought it was going to turn out. Huh, interesting. Fact about the world. If it happens again, maybe I'll go about it differently. But there isn't regret. Regret's an emotion. There's not much emotional content there talking to him. And he's remarkably free of self-pity. I have not heard any self-pity coming out of him. It's not, feel sorry for me. He doesn't want you to feel sorry for him. What I get out of him is interesting observations about the prison population and interesting observations about daily life in prison and observations about the world at large. That what he's seen, for example, the way the bankruptcy people have handled the case and have largely disguised the fact that everybody would be even richer if they hadn't shown up for work because they sold a bunch of the assets a little too cheaply and that kind of thing. He's interested in it.
And sees the irony of it.
Sees the irony of it. So he remains an unusual person, and now he's in even more unusual circumstances.
Michael Lewis's book is called Going Infinite. The paperback version has an afterword that he wrote after the trial and after the sentencing of Sam Bankman-Fried. It's really worth reading, and it is out now. If you would like to read more and see more about Sam Bankman-Fried and effective altruism, and also about the subjects of our most recent episodes with Shannon Valor on the history of thinking about thinking machines, all of that is in the latest edition of our newsletter, and it's out tomorrow. It's free, comes out every fortnight, and to sign up, all you have to do is click on the link in the show description, or you can go to our website, ppfideas.com. All of our past newsletters are there, and they can all be read. Also, if you'd like to sign up to PPF Plus, where you will get the final bonus episode from our series with Shannon, in which she tells us where she thinks AI is heading, do also just click on the link in the show description or go to our website, ppfideas.com. We are about to start a new series. It begins on Sunday, and it is about the great political films, a subject that was suggested to us by many listeners after our great political fiction series. So we're going to do it. And we're going to be talking about a lot of very different films from very different eras. We're starting with a series of 4 films, 4 episodes on 4 films that were released within 6 years of each other and have some common themes. The first, which comes out on Sunday, is La Grande Illusion, and it's going to be followed by Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Citizen Kane, and the life and death of Colonel Blimp. All of that is to come. Do please join us for the great political films. This has been Past, Present, Future, brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books.